which some of you might know some pieces of this. So I'm a research professor at George Washington University, which means I'm self-employed. I look on paper like I'm an employee, but basically they give me a title and the opportunity to bring in money to the university, and I only get paid what I bring in. I'm not part of a school, I'm part of just a unit of people like me who work semi-independently. And my background is in regional economic development. This is my summer intern from
a long time ago.
A long time ago. See, Margie, another connection. So back in the day, I looked at cities and states and their economies and how they worked, and you need good data, so you get data from the Census and Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I ended up getting knowledgeable about the sources and uses of federal statistics, and about 15 years ago moved from Boston to DC to work at Brookings to focus on the role, improving the capacity of the federal government to provide data on population and economics at a state and local and neighborhood level. So I ended up being an advocate for data users. And when I left Brookings, I kept doing the same thing, but one of the projects I worked on at Brookings, which I'm reprising this year, is helping people understand the uses of census data derived from the decennial census to allocate federal funding. You might remember that, right? 2010 was still the pretty beginning of the Great Recession, and it was actually before the Tea Party. So there was a lot of interest in the role of the federal government in giving out money. Right? And so I ended up identifying the federal programs that rely on data derived from the census to allocate money geographically, the implication being that you want an accurate count for your community, because if you don't, you're going to lose money. To your point, then. So that worked out well, and so advocates came to me in 2016, could I do it again, with a lot more lead time. So that's been a fat chunk of my work over the last couple of years, and I'll have some things to hand out about that slice of, I'll talk more about the census more broadly. And because of that work regarding, so it turns out now, I am the national expert on the role of the federal government in allocating funds based on census data. So when the secretary, when Naomi's boss, now boss, Secretary Ross, decided to add a citizenship question to the census for 2020, a year ago, there were lots of lawsuits where people, there were 6 lawsuits in 3 venues around the country: New York, California, San Francisco, and Maryland, Greenbelt. 2 cases per site, and so I got retained as an expert. The plaintiffs retained experts across all these cases, demographers, and I was retained for each case regarding what the impact would be of a citizenship question on the misallocation of federal funds. So that ended up taking up 3 months of my time, last in 2018, that I hadn't planned for. It was very interesting, and all 3 cases have been decided in favor of the plaintiffs. The last one was decided on Friday, just 2 days ago, the Maryland case. And all this is going to the Supreme Court. There's a hearing in 2.5 weeks. So we can talk about that. So I have some, I'm going to kind of work through some handouts, beginning with the Constitution about the census.
Oh, we still have a Constitution?
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we can still have a Constitution.
The census was created by the founders as a vehicle for doing 2 things. One was to determine the number of seats in the House of Representatives each state gets, because that's done on the basis of population. So you want an accurate count to allocate funds. And the second is there was this idea at the beginning that the government would tax the states And so if you're gonna tax the states, you wanna get money from states that are proportional to the number of people they have. So that was the second purpose, which has never really been used. But clearly from the get-go, counting the number of people in each state. Carla, you just wanna read the yellow there?
Sure. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall by law direct.
Great, okay.
Yeah, this is the 3/5 was,
Yeah.
I thought it did.
What is that?
I didn't realize that 3/5 was.
Was in
there.
Yeah, I thought it was.
This is where the 3/5 is,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. No, I assumed they got rid of it after with the amendments. But.
Well, so the amendments do not change the
Right,
Constitution.
right. So there's nobody left that's 3/5.
Correct.
But so this includes all. Now, what about 3? What is?
What's that?
What about free? Is that are all people free now?
Free, yes,
Whether
all
they're-
people are free.
So whether they're citizens here illegally or anything they are.
Correct, that's a great
Ah.
point. So
Right,
this is not counting citizens, this is counting
Right.
the number of people.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Um,
And so the free doesn't have any meaning
Slaves.
anymore.
right,
Oh, it does.
Slaves were counted only as 3/5 a person.
correct, and of course slaves couldn't vote, so it was part of a compromise.
Right.
But the result was if you had 100,000 people in Massachusetts and 100,000 people in South Carolina, but South Carolina had 200,000 slaves, they
Yes.
got a lot more
They got a lot
representation in
more, right.
Congress, even
This
though.
was one of the deals, right, I
Correct.
remember that.
At
I
the
didn't realize this
beginning
is
of
where it
the
was,
Civil
but I knew
War,
that.
A majority of the persons in the state of South Carolina were slaves.
Correct.
Mhm.
Correct. So this is the law. Now, this was the Constitution. It was an election in 1788. Washington's elected president. And Congress meets 1789. And they start in early 1790. They start debating the Census Act of 1790 because now they're going to do the first census. So James Madison gets on the floor of the House. I'm going to walk out with paper
Oh, good.
tonight.
I feel like we're in a class.
You
We're
are.
in a college class at GW.
I think it's going in both directions.
Margie, you got it?
I will.
Okay.
Margie, do you want to sit right here? Okay, thank you. Or I
First, you
can
want to
sit
read
there
the
and-
first paragraph here?
Or if you prefer, I can sit right here, whatever's better.
Mr. Madison observed that they had now an opportunity of obtaining the most useful information for those who should hereafter be called upon to legislate for their country if this bill was extended so as to embrace some other objects besides the bare enumeration of the inhabitants. It would enable them to adapt the public measures to the particular circumstances of the community.
Okay, yeah, just keep going.
Keep going. All of it? Or skip to the next highlight?
To the end of the paragraph.
Oh, to the end of the paragraph. Okay. In order to know the various interests of the United States, it was necessary that the description of the several classes into which the community was divided should be accurately known. On this knowledge, the legislature might proceed to make a proper provision for the agricultural, commercial, and manufacturing interests. But without it, they could never make their provisions in due proportion.
Okay. Devorah, you just want to read the yellow?
This kind of information, he observed, all legislators had wished for, but this kind of information had never been obtained in any country. He wished, therefore, to avail himself of the present opportunity of accomplishing so valuable a purpose. If the plan was pursued in taking every future census, it would give them an opportunity of making the progress of the society and distinguishing the growth of every interest.
Great. So what you see here is that Madison has this bright idea that, so before I say that, so look now in the middle, it says, Mr. Madison presented a schedule which he moved should be inserted in lieu of free white males under 16, free white males above 16. So he's saying, ask gender, ask race, ask age.
He's also creating the notion of longitudinal.
Yeah.
So
So the and et cetera there, he also asked for occupation. So what he's saying, right, for apportionment, people's demographic characteristics do not matter, right? It doesn't matter if you're 8 or 80. So what he's saying is, look, as long as we're counting people for apportionment, let's ask some questions about who they are, because we want to actually know our population. And this is information that no legislature's ever had before. Right.
And this is just because we want to know, not that we need it yet.
Yes, his point is that we can legislate better if we understand the characteristics of the population. And his point that Devorah just read is that if we do this every census, then we can measure the progress.
Can I ask you, on the previous page, it said, the first yellow paragraph, it said, if the bill was extended to embrace other objects besides the bare enumeration. So that's what you're discussing now. Occupation,
yes.
Gender.
Yeah, objects is not objectives, it's other
items.
categories.
Okay, thank you.
So, going back a little, I realized, so Indians were not counted in any way, shape,
Correct.
or form.
Unless they paid taxes.
Pardon? They did pay taxes?
Unless they paid taxes.
So that's what I was just wondering.
Excluding Indians that are not
Taxed.
taxed.
So does that mean some Indians are and some aren't?
I think some Indians actually became like engaged with commerce and,
Okay,
yeah,
all right, so but there was no count of Indians.
I don't believe so.
Was what your voter read also suggesting, and I actually don't have it for me, that it's good for commerce, that they would know more about trends,
Yes, that's right.
manufacturing,
Yeah,
and
that's right, yes.
what they need.
That's right.
Okay.
So the result was that every census, Congress, up until I think the early part of the 20th century, Congress controlled the questions. Congress actually picked the questions.
Oh.
And with the progression of the census, Congress kept adding more and more questions. So as you got into the 19th century, there were more and more categories. But it was a really important source of information for actually understanding how the country was growing. And people really depended on it, to the point that in the 1870s, President Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, said, we shouldn't have to wait every 10 years to actually get this data. We're growing so quickly, why don't we have a mid-decade census? And Congress didn't accept that, but that was his idea. So this is more context. From 1790 to 1930, as the questions on the census were asked of everybody, every household had to answer the questions. Well, in the 30s, the notion of sampling and statistical design got more sophisticated. So by 1940, people figured out we can ask some of these questions to a sample of the population, not everybody. An anecdote. So 1930 happens, right? It's the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover is president. And the census, the 1930 census, asked people, are you employed? So the result was there was an unemployment rate that got published based on the decennial census, which was, it got up to 25%, so it was somewhere up there. And Hoover was very upset. He says, well, we have to wait till 1940 to measure the unemployment again. Well, in the 30s, people figured out how you do household sample surveys, and they started developing much more frequent measures of unemployment. But that was the attitude. So in 1940 and 1950, there were some questions, and at this point there are like 20 or 30 questions about your income and your occupation and how you get to work and how many bedrooms you have in your house, and it was all to help the government design programs. There was a citizenship question up through 1950. Are you a citizen or not? And
And it's not just used by the government to design
correct.
programs. It's used.
Correct. So I'm going to get to the broader uses. From 1960 to 2000, there was something called the long form. Right? Remember the long form?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Right. So what the government did was really shorten the survey that everyone got. And so for 2010, it was like 10 questions. It's really very short. And then you send the long form to a sample. In 1960, it was 25% of the households. By 2000, it was 16.5%. It's just 1/8. Okay. So you think of that Madison's idea, right? They ask these questions so government can work better. Congress, everyone gets all the questions from 1790 to 1930. Then there's this little bit of some sampling in 1940 and 50. Then there's a long form, 1960 to 2000. And then people are going, okay, this data is so great. Why don't we do the long form continually? And so that's what's now called the American Community Survey. Right? But the American Community, I've told people at Census that they should call it the Madison Community Survey because it's really Madison's idea,
Right.
just brought into the 21st century. So the questions on the long form, they've changed some, but it's pretty much, again, the same questions. Income, how you get to work, how, do you have running water, and actually internet use now. So so it's called the ACS, and the ACS is really like the workhorse of the federal statistical surveys.
So what percentage
Well,
fit
on
this?
The ACS goes to 300,000 households a month. It's a big survey.
Oh, it's
I
continuing.
got one of those like not that long ago.
Yeah.
I got one. Yeah.
Because
Oh,
continuously
so this
they
is
do-
not every 10 years. This is a.
No, this is every month,
Every
in
month.
lieu of every 10 years.
Oh, the
So
ACS that's part of the basis of the first priority reports.
no, that's different. That's called the
That's
current population.
Certain population.
Wait, so the
It's only from
ACS
March.
is done monthly to the same population, or they just,
It's a
varies?
it's a sample. So the idea was, for the long form, the way the long form ended, it was going to 16% of households, 16.5% of households. And the idea was to do on a monthly basis 60 months of ACS. In other words, 5 years, 5 times 12, right? And to cover roughly the same population in 5 years that you're covering with the long form. Okay? So the result is they're aiming for roughly 3% of the households a year
to do a long form?
for the long form.
And there is a citizen's question.
There has been a citizenship question on the long form and on the American Community Survey for a government purpose. And this is what the secretary had referred to. The Voting Rights Act, 1965.
Yeah, I was gonna ask.
There's constant litigation about the design of districts, what's legit and what's not legit. So there are, and the Supreme Court has come down with a bunch of rules that are not in legislation, but they're interpreting the legislation. So, for instance, the colloquial verbs are cracking and packing. Let's say you have a state like Texas, where and the Republicans are in charge of the legislature. So how do you design districts that maximize the Republican, the ability of Republicans to send Republicans to Congress and minimize the, so the packing is that you design districts where you make them 98% Democratic, right? Because whether it's 52% Democratic or 98% Democratic, the Democrats are
Doesn't
going to
matter.
win. So you might as well just put as many
All the
Democrats as you
Democrats
can in it
in
and
few
make the other
districts.
districts Republican. Okay? So the packing is pushing your opponent's voters in a place, and cracking is actually taking a concentration of those voters and splitting them up into 6 different districts.
Yeah.
So let's say you had a district that would have been majority Democratic voters with 60% of the votes, you just cut them up and you're giving a 6 to these surrounding districts. And so the Supreme Court rules that you can't do that. And also, you have to pay attention in the design of the voting districts of the number of citizens, of people who can vote, right? Because back to somebody's earlier point, the census is done. Your voting status does not matter. The number of seats in the House is based on total population, irrespective of whether you're here legally or illegally. And that's what the proponents of the citizenship question want to change, by the way. Okay, so but in the design of the districts, the Supreme Court said that the state legislature, you also have to take into account the number of citizens in these districts, because you don't want to dilute that either. So the result is that every year, the Department of Justice, which is responsible for regulating the Voting Rights Act, pays the Census Bureau to come up with a data set called Citizen Voting Age Population, CVAP. And the idea is for every neighborhood, on the basis of the ACS citizenship question, to estimate the number of people who are citizens and of voting age, because that's important in the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act.
So is it that those citizens need to be distributed within a state fairly, or just that you make sure you count them?
I'm not sure of what the rule is. Yeah, I probably knew at one point and I've forgotten. But now I will go into the rationale for adding the citizenship question, or the purported rationale. Okay.
Which
So
is not related to redistricting in the Maryland and other case that's before.
It's not related to the gerrymandering
Right.
cases.
Okay.
All right. Okay. There is the public story about why Naomi's boss.
Right.
Where'd she go? Yeah.
She's hiding out because she can't stand her. Doesn't want him to find her.
The law gives the Secretary of Commerce the right to determine what goes on the census.
And the responsibility to notify Congress.
What's that?
And the responsibility to notify Congress.
Correct. And 3 years out, so in the year ending in 7, they have to. The Secretary has to tell Congress what subjects are going to be covered, and in the year ending in 8, he has to say what questions will be asked. So when the Trump people got into office, okay, that's all right. I have a copy of the letter here, which I'll pass around. In March of 2018, Wilbur Ross writes, Secretary of Commerce writes this memo, this 8-page memo, to his undersecretary who oversees the Census Bureau, and basically says, I got a request from the Department of Justice that says that the CVAP data, right, Citizen Voting Age Population data, developed from the American Community Survey is insufficient to enforce the Voting Rights Act, because it's a sample, because it's only 3% of the population sampled every year.
Okay.
The sample's not big enough to really get down to the real to the block level, right? Census has census tracts, and then it has block groups, and it has blocks. And I believe the CVAP, you can get down to the block group level, but not the block, right? So Secretary Ross purports that the Department of Justice came to him and said, we need citizenship data at the block level to properly enforce the Voting Rights Act. And therefore, we ask you to add citizenship to the decennial form, not just the American Community Survey. Okay, so that is his rationale for this. Okay. My aim here is actually to tell two stories that are related. One is about the citizenship question, because I know a lot of you are interested in that, but the other is for Barbara and Chris, and the others is just kind of the broader uses. They relate because if the citizenship question screws up the census,
Right.
then the other stuff is. So, but I'm kind of going with the citizenship thing right now, so I'll keep going with it. As I say, these people sued, 6 cases. I ended up being so impressed by the plaintiffs' lawyers and by the judges, the rulings. And again, I brought, so this is Ross's letter, and this is what came out Friday from Maryland.
Oh, that's right, I heard it on the radio.
It was clear that somebody got to Ross early in the Trump administration and said, you got to get the citizenship question on the decennial. And so he starts. This is through discovery, right? This is through the Census Bureau. People did not know this until the trial.
Oh.
That Ross's political people were basically going to the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security saying, "Will you ask for this citizenship question?" And DOJ turned him down, and DHS turned him down at the beginning.
Because they didn't need this.
DOJ did not want to do it, and they said it was because of the Comey, the problems with Comey and Hillary Clinton and all that. So they didn't want to be in the news, so they turned him down. And it took Ross the better part of 2017 to actually figure out a way to. He ended up talking to Sessions, the Attorney General, and Sessions told his. The guy that wrote the letter to Census, the guy that wrote the letter to Census that Ross used to justify what he was doing was not in the Voting Rights Division, was not in the Civil Rights Division. He was in the Management Division. He was a guy in a different part of DOJ, but the secretary could get him to write this thing. Didn't come from the Civil Rights people. Okay, so a quote from this ruling is, the secretary's motivations remain a mystery.
That's a nice way to put it.
The plaintiffs
that's in the
wanted to
that was
depose.
in the article in the paper.
Right. The plaintiffs wanted to depose the secretary, and they deposed his political people, who all had amnesia.
Couldn't remember.
They couldn't remember lots of things.
Did they misremember? What a new word.
This is the belief among the advocates. There's
Okay.
2 reasons why they went at the citizenship question. One is that in 2014 or 15, a bunch of Texas conservatives sued the state of Texas, saying that Texas should draw its state legislative districts on the basis of the number of citizens, not the number of residents, because by doing it on the number of residents, whether you're illegal or a non-citizen, you're diluting the voting power
The rights
of
of
citizens, because maybe in one district only 10,000 citizens elect someone, but in another district 15,000. So it went to the Supreme Court, and Texas was the defendant, but Texas told the Supreme Court, we Texas have the right, if we want, to actually draw districts on the basis of citizens. Now, think about it. If you have a district with a lot of non-citizens, then if you have to equalize the number of citizens in each district, you're going to have some districts that are really, really big with lots of non-citizens. So you can pack all these people who are not voting into this district and really make these other districts even more Republican than they are. So, but Texas is asserting we have the right, if we want to actually draw the districts on the basis of citizenship, we choose not to. And the Supreme Court said, I think we agree with that. We're going to deny the plaintiff's case because the citizenship data aren't good enough to actually draw districts that meet the law. If there were data from the decennial census on citizenship, then that would be good enough. Okay?
What year is the Texas case?
I think it was decided in 2015 or 2016. I think that it's called Evanell or Evanwell or something like that.
Okay.
So there has never been a direct connection in all these court cases about that rationale, but that's everyone's belief, because that was, right, the sense is that Kobach and Stephen Miller and Stephen Bannon were the ones behind this, and they were very aware of this. The idea is to draw legislative districts on the basis of number of citizens, not what's been done since the beginning of the country, the number of residents, period. Okay. So the court cases in each of the three court cases, there's basically no daylight between the rulings of the three court cases. There are a couple differences. In San Francisco and in Maryland, there are three grounds for, the judge found three grounds for denying the placement of the citizenship question. One was violation of the enumeration clause that we just read, right? That states would not be appropriate, not be appropriately represented in Congress if there was a citizenship question. And so to back up, the assertion that the government agrees with actually is that the introduction of a citizenship question would cause what's labeled a differential undercount, which means this. Roughly 7% of the nation are 7% of the nation's residents are not citizens. Okay? And of those 7%, about half are legally here and half are not legally here. The fear is, and there is some research to back this up, that if you, particularly with this administration, if you give people the census and they ask, are you a citizen? And you say no, people are afraid of being deported. Now, the law says that the Census Bureau can't share the data with anybody, but a lot of people are not going to believe that. So there is a sense, and the courts and the sense, everyone agreed, the plaintiffs, the defendants, that the introduction of a citizenship question would cause an undercount, would cause some people to not fill out the form. The differential part comes, so for whatever reason, the biggest states have the largest percentage of non-citizens. Right. Biggest states, California, Texas, Florida, New York. If you rank the states in terms of the percentage of their population that are non-citizens, California, Texas, Florida, New York. So the result is that there's just a handful. There's just a handful of states with California's percentage is 13.5, so almost double the national average. And Texas is not far behind. Texas is like 11 because it's on the border. But the result is that only a handful of states are above the national average, and 40-some states are below the national average. But the result is that because California, Texas, Florida are so high in terms of percentage, they're going to have a greater undercount. That's the differential undercount. Okay.
Well, they're going to lose congressional seats.
So they would lose.
Right. And so that was their claim, and that's what the California judge and the Maryland judge said is, yes, there's a violation here of the enumeration clause, and he's citing, you'll see, if you want to look at this, that California could lose 1 to 3 seats. Okay. So the second piece of the case, which is actually stuff from my testimony, was the impact of the differential undercount on the distribution of federal funds. Okay. Okay. So,
And,
yeah,
one of the things that I always thought was odd was that on the apportionment question of the members of the House, that states such as North Carolina, Georgia, as well as Florida and Texas, which have Republican legislatures, would lose House seats.
yes,
And so I thought it would have been a Pyrrhic victory for them, because they were out to get California to a great extent, but they would end up shifting to other states.
Right.
I think the beliefs, like for Texas, was that if they lost seats, they would make sure it was Democratic
Oh,
seats.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And
But still,
absolutely.
Carl's point is there's still an overall
and
loss.
in
Yeah.
North Carolina and other places that concentrated in urban areas, but
Right.
they would still lose congressional seats.
Yes,
And
that's
I
right.
think
That's right.
that it's was just, as I said, Pyrrhic on their
It was a calculation. It was the importance of keeping political dominance is such that they were willing to give up some seats.
The other question I had, and you've mentioned sampling since 30, is I recall, and please correct me because I'm probably wrong, there was a court case, I believe by big cities, about undercounts in one of the census, and they argued that sampling could make up for this, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't sample.
Correct. So actually, Joel
And
raised
then,
that.
and then, as I understand it, the administration has made the same sampling case.
That latter part's not correct. So
Okay.
let me. It's a good moment to answer this question. After every census does something called census coverage measurement, in which in which they pick communities around the country and they flood them with census workers to get the most accurate count they can get, and then they compare it to the numbers they got from the census. And their aim is to measure the miscount. Okay, how many people they missed, also how many people they double counted.
Right.
I'll get to that in a moment. So historically, white people are counted much more accurately than African Americans and Hispanics.
More accurately or just more?
More accurately.
Okay.
So in 1980 and 1990, 1 out of 20 African Americans and 1 out of 20 Hispanics were missed. It was a 95%. It was a 5% undercount. That's huge. And for Democrats, that's a big deal because not counting them dilutes their legislative districts. So in the 90s, the Clinton administration proposed that statistical adjustment be done. The idea is that census would do the census coverage measurement, and they would say, okay, well, we counted 95 African Americans, so we'll call it 100 because we undercount, we missed 5, and we'll do apportionment on the basis of the adjusted count. So the Republicans sued, and the Supreme Court ruled no, that the census has to be for the purposes of apportionment, it's the actual count. You cannot do adjustment. So the good that came out of that was in 2000 and then in 2010, Census created a new program called the Census Partnership Program. And the idea was to create third-party partners in cities and states, church groups, synagogues, advocacy organizations, probably some of the organizations you work with, to be trusted intermediaries that would tell people, for every census as, right, the idea is to, you've heard of get out the vote, and that the census tries to get out the count. And to help, I met 2 weeks ago with Maryland has a state government employee whose job it is to promote the census in Maryland for all the reasons, because Maryland's money and apportionment relies on it. So Census produces maps of hard to count areas. Like they know the rate of return, for every 100 surveys they get that how many get mailed back, or this time it'll be through internet, but up until this time it was always by mail back. And so they do these predictions, estimations of hard to count areas. And the idea is to create relationships with local organizations and give them the materials so they can reach out to these hard to count areas to participate. Just because someone doesn't mail back the form doesn't mean they're not counted, right? There is what's called, part of the case was something, the acronym is NARFO, non-response follow-up.